Thank you, Chris. Since this is a day for celebrating all that happened at Kid Camp a few weeks ago, I'd like to give you, especially for those of you that weren't able to participate, a few snapshots of moments that happened there. Are you up for that? Okay, about a half a dozen of you are, so I'm going to press on. So the first was on a day when Scott Greer, who was leading our science experimentation lab, was outside exploring what happens when you mix Alka-Seltzer and water in a contained environment like a film canister. Maybe you know what happens, but it's pretty exciting. We were inside the office working, and I heard our office manager, Janice, on the phone. And I heard her saying, I'm sorry. There are children exploding things right outside the window, so I can't really hear you, but I would be happy to get back to you at another time. And here's why I think that is such an important thing for us to sort of know and remember, is that this last week offered us an opportunity to kind of flip the script on what's happening in the neighborhood. There are destructive things sometimes happening right outside our window in this neighborhood that make it difficult for it to get our work done. But this time it was amazing kids exploring the delights of science right outside. And I think that is a wonderful message about sort of subverting the difficulties of this time with an intrusion of our own joy and positivity. Another snapshot I want to give you, you already saw part of this morning. It was as kids and as many adults just dancing forever for about 30 or 40 minutes a morning with just unadulterated joy, just screaming out, "Let your light shine." And all the different kinds of voices that you could hear being part of that group from throughout the life spectrum. And for me, that moment is really important to plant in my memory and to know about and remember, because it was such an affirmation of the value of intergenerational community that is so rare in so many of our lives outside the church. Not just learning from people in different generations, but celebrating and singing and having fun with them. And that was a really beautiful moment. Another snapshot that I'm taking away from that time was Rebecca Dennis standing over a pot of smoking lemonade, dry ice for the win, while the children all crowd around her talking excitedly about sublimation. Is Rebecca still in here? Is it sublimation? Yes. Condensation, something else, and sublimation. And I thought that was just such a beautiful moment in which we were watching young people understand the world as a place of awe and wonder, and understanding that those kinds of exploration absolutely belong in the church. That the word sublimation at its root is something that came from God's ingenuity and creativity, and I love that. Another snapshot I have is Kathy Conklin surrounded by an entire room of just recyclable materials that you all, man, when we ask for things out of your garage, you guys respond. You were probably all just grateful to get space back around your recycle bins, and we were grateful to have all the things that you helpfully contributed over these last months. And just Kathy and her Linda, and then later Cindy, sort of empowering these kids each to make their own creations. Each had a very unique and distinct vision about what they were going to build with all this stuff. And I just loved that moment of feeling as though our kids are being empowered by the loving adults around them to enact their vision of what they want to build in this world. Now, a last thing that really is sticking in my mind is myself dressed like this. And I know that there is someone in here who has video of this that I hope will not surface at some inopportune moment. But me dressed like this, a mad scientist, along with Gail Black, dressed like a biblical character, bantering back and forth about how we change our hearts, not in a machine, but through presence with the sacred. And the kids yelling things like, "We know it's you, Pastor Liz, we know it's you, Pastor you." Is it you? Is it you? We know it's you. Is it you? And I loved to know that they were experiencing that sort of playful, experimental joy that can happen in theater, and that they were understanding that the church is a place for that the church is a place where it's okay to be sure and not sure. The church is a place where it's okay to say, I know this to be true, and also, is this true? I know it's true, but is it true? You know, having those opportunities together. And it was just such a joyful week together, and it really felt like building something. Like the experience of building an experience or a tradition or a community. And it reminded me how important it is to nurture that which is growing in our midst. Now, I'll tell you, the other night I was doing exactly the opposite of that. I was all alone late at night when I should have been asleep, just doom scrolling on the phone. Do any of you have this problem? I got to go to sleep, but I should doom scroll some sad things in the world before I do. And the algorithm, capital A, served up to me a New York Times piece entitled, "Why We Shouldn't Give Up on Organized Religion." Google knows me so well, it just knew I would click on the why. Yeah, you're right, I agree, but why? The article contained an interview with Eboo Patel, who is a former member of President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, say that 10 times fast, but who is now the president of Interfaith America, a nonprofit aiming to promote cooperation across religious difference in the Chicago area. And he just released a new book entitled, "We Need to Build: Field Notes for a Diverse Democracy." And the article I contained just had so many gems. I thought I'm just going to get up there and tell them every single gem in this. I'll just read them this article and it'll be a great sermon. We don't have time for that today, but one day maybe. There was one idea, though, that was particularly resonant for me, and it was this. Patel was talking about how we are in a time of massive deconstruction right now, in which the entire social change arena has moved into the direction of critique rather than construction. Now, which has a lot of benefits. This is me talking. I think it has benefits in that we're deconstructing some huge things right now. Racism and sexism and heteronormativity and things that rightfully need to be deconstructed. But Patel's point seems to be that we need to balance those critiques with construction, with building things and building institutions and systems and platforms and groups and relationships that can grow the world we do want, rather than solely delegitimize the one we don't want. Patel seems to think, and maybe there's a conversation here, a debate that we could have, but Patel seems to think that perhaps we've leaned too far in the direction of criticism. A sentiment summed up in this quote, "A healthy sector cannot have 100 arsonists for every architect." And I've just been thinking about that so much. See, sometimes doom scrolling has great benefits. You get amazing inspiration. I think about that so much, and that I do feel that. You know, I feel that we've been in this time of rejection and dismissal and protest and tearing down and cancellation, and I know that in a way that's all very necessary, because the roots of some of these insidious systems go so deep among us. But I also feel in this time of emerging from this great disruption of the pandemic, but I also feel a yearning to be a builder, to work on whatever the new things will be. And I have to wonder if Jesus felt that tension too a little bit in his ministry. Now, this passage we just heard Chris read comes in a long line of parables which aim to describe the nature of the reign of God. R-E-I-G-N, the reign of God. This includes what we heard last week about seeds scattered in various places, and goes on from there to that well-known bit about the mustard seed. Remember that? That's coming up right next. All agricultural metaphors attempting to communicate what God's power is like over and against the worldly powers operating in the lives of the hearers at that time. Here, again and again and again, in all these distinct parables, Jesus says God's power is like this: a field planted with good seed and then infested with weeds. But in this one, he says something surprising. He says, don't worry about pulling up all the weeds, because you might disrupt what's coming to be. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that I think Jesus was not for dismantling oppressive systems. I believe he was, and that elsewhere in Scripture we see that directive. Sometimes he's talking about ripping up the whole plant. He's complaining about the fig tree. He's turning over tables. But this teaching, this proclamation, has me kind of curious and wondering about the point that he's trying to make here, which could be said to be a warning about balance, about turning some proportion of our attention always to the work of growth and nurture and fertilization and building, rather than solely getting rid of what doesn't serve. It also seems to me, in thinking about it this week, to imply that the binary thinking that tends to dominate our political discourse right now, and this is true for me too, that binary, us, them, good, bad, that may not always be a help to us, but rather that it is the case that some tolerance for ambiguity may be necessary as we wait for God's time to be fulfilled. I think it's a way of saying there will always be wheat and weeds. There will always be construction and deconstruction. There will always be justice and injustice. There may always be love and hatred. But the existence of all these realities doesn't excuse us from the work of building what God has called us to build, which is tolerance and compassion and mercy and care. And when I think about it that way, I wonder if this isn't an interesting lens through which we can view the world and the church and our lives right now. Certainly not the only one, but one option. What are we engaged in building in the world? What are we making right now? What new things are coming to be through our acts of engagement or service when we leave this place? Certainly the answer is different for each of us, but the question remains important. Maybe even here in the church, what new things are we birthing? How can we put more attention there? Are we pruning and fertilizing old things so that they can produce new growth? Or maybe you just want to stay focused on your own life. Are you focused on the can'ts and the shouldn'ts and the not yets and the woe is me's? I know I find myself there sometimes. But other times I feel a summon to learn to live alongside those things and at the same time build a life of yeses and of loves and of celebrations and of mercies and of newness. It sort of boils down to what are we paying attention to and what are we nurturing in our lives? In what areas are you an arsonist and in which are you an architect? And I think just paying attention to those things has some spiritual import, some spiritual meaning. And I have to say, this is not a plug for future years volunteers, but if you receive it that way, perhaps that is the Spirit speaking. Spending a week with our kids at Kid Camp really drove this home for me. Because I know through the lives of my own kids that we are handing them a difficult world. We are handing them a field full of weeds, we are. And I despair about that so much, often late at night. But all of it means that I find comfort and purpose in the work I do to equip them to build things in spite of that. To build relationships and systems and art and science experiments and songs that will help sustain the goodness until the time comes for some of this really hard stuff to get sorted out. And I will say, just as another note, that I had the same feeling last week at the Portland Pride Parade. I want to thank those of you who held down the fort here, and specifically to Desiree Eden Ocampo, who led part of the service so I could Uber downtown and join our group of 25 folks from Rose City Park Presbyterian Church as we marched through the streets bearing a message about God's expansive love. I will tell you, it was pretty hot out there. And the wait for the parade to begin, endlessly long, but the march really was a joy. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of people there, 5, 6, 10 deep along the sidelines. And everywhere we went, people clapped and cheered us on. So it seemed that the blessing of that really was mutual. That kind of public witness can be so energizing, much more energizing than arguing with or about our detractors, but rather embodying, with no one's permission, a world in which the church does show up for the LGBT community. The church affirms their blessedness and their gifts and marches with them in the struggle for full inclusion and justice. And so I guess what I take away from those things is, how do we do more things like that? I think that's the question. What more do we want to grow and plant together? How do we want to build and nurture alongside our work to deconstruct the things that God's justice calls us to deconstruct? How do we do more things like that feel like that? And how do we do them together? It's a grand experiment that I think our change makers will be a meaningful part of, but I offer those questions and investigations to you in the name of the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.